In this video, I'll be discussing various mechanics relating to how visions are triggered and how high-level enemies use arts. Unlike most of the videos I've made, this video will be primarily scripted and post-commentated, and will have a decent amount of editing. This isn't a format that I'm used to using, so I hope the information will still be easy to follow. I'd also like to give a disclaimer that the information presented here is strictly from my own personal observations and experiences, and thus might contain some slight errors. Additionally, the information in this video only applies to high-level enemies, as some of the points I make do not hold for relatively low-level enemies. Even with that said, there are still some minor exceptions to some of the information which I will make a point of whenever it is relevant, specifically in the case of despotic Ursen and triggering of visions. However, the information in this video should be mostly correct and is what I used to plan several of the superboss fights that I've done. This video won't focus much on the application of enemy art and vision mechanics, but will instead focus on the mechanics and theory of them. However, I will still be giving some examples when applicable. The major reason I chose to make this video is that art and vision mechanics are something that are important to know to do many of the difficult superboss fights that I've done on my channel. However, as far as I know, there is no place where this information is well documented. Because of this, combined with the large amount of time that I've spent on superboss fights which require careful planning and dealing with various arts and getting visions at important times, I figured that I would be a good person to create a video on this topic. In the first section of this video, I'll be discussing how enemy AI uses arts. The first thing to know about how high-level enemies use arts is that certain arts are only used after certain HP thresholds are passed. Right now, a sped up clip will be playing of several minutes of me fighting Avalanche Absi without damaging him. Throughout this clip, Absi does not use an art a single time. This is because Absi's first art that he will use is Ultra Playbite, which he starts using after he has about 90% of his HP remaining. Many superbosses have similar behavior to this, where certain arts will only be used at or below certain HP thresholds, or where certain arts will be used at different frequencies based on their HP. For the sake of making a point, I'd like to give Absi's art pattern. Absi will only use auto attacks until he reaches around 90% HP, at which point he begins using Ultra Playbite. At around 75% HP, he begins using Ultra Tail Strike, and at around 70% HP, he begins using Demon Purging Fire. At 60% HP, Absi will use Ultra Air Crush 10, then activate his Crazed Aura, but will not use Ultra Air Crush 10 in his normal art cycle at this point. Absi will continue using Ultra Playbite, Ultra Tail Strike, and Demon Purging Fire until he reaches 30% HP left. At 30% HP, Absi will activate his Awakening Aura, then use Ultra Air Crush 10. From this point until the end of the fight, Absi will begin using Ultra Air Crush 10 in his normal art rotation. This information is consistent regardless of how fast or slow the battle against Absi is, so knowing this information can be useful for knowing which arts you need to be careful of and when. Other notable examples of this are the Bel'Ghazas doesn't use Mountain Stomp until around 80% HP, and how Daedalus uses arts much less frequency after entering Crazed at 30% HP. Knowing various HP thresholds for enemies using arts and what attacks they can use at various HP ranges can be very useful when planning out more difficult battles. Examples of how this information can be useful include knowing to save a chain attack to survive when Blizzard Bel'Ghazas first uses Mountain Stomp at 80% HP, or knowing to save Shulk's talent art for when Ancient Daedalus enters Crazed at 30% HP, since you won't be getting many more visions due to Daedalus using arts less frequently. Next, I'd like to discuss something I refer to as art scripts. The idea of this is that certain superbosses will always use certain arts in certain orders. The example of this that I'm going to provide, and which is currently playing in the video, is Absi's art script if you do a large amount of damage to him very quickly. If you quickly deal enough damage to Absi to bring him below 60% HP where he activates Craze, Absi will always use the following arts in the following order. He will use Ultra Playbite, Demon Purging Fire, Ultra Air Crush 10, then activate Craze. This holds up even if Absi's HP is below 30%, where he should activate Awakening. Now let's talk about how visions work. Visions are an incredibly useful mechanic which gives several advantages. These include charging talent arts of characters with Glorious Future, giving you the ability to weaken and negate a powerful enemy art, or providing you with 8 to 16 seconds of the enemy not attacking you. Thus, being able to manipulate visions gives incredibly useful utility. This then leads us to the question, how can we consistently get visions from enemies at important moments? In Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition, visions are triggered when art will land the character being targeted at a small percentage of their max HP. While it's hard to say the exact percentage that triggers a vision, from my experience it's roughly 10%. This means that characters with smaller max HP stats will need to be brought to a lower HP value than characters with relatively high HP stats. Knowing this, and with knowledge of enemy stats and available arts, it's possible and relatively simple to manage your stats and HP value to get visions consistently from various arts that superbosses can use. It's important to note that visions are only triggered based on the character being targeted by the art. This means that if an enemy is targeting your tank with an AoE art, and your tank is expected to easily survive the attack, the art can still kill the rest of your party without triggering a vision. Examples of this include Dunban being expected to dodge a physical AoE art, or high HP characters like Ryan or Ricky being expected to survive AoE arts with a reasonable percentage of their max HP remaining. Another note about visions is that they are triggered based on the expected damage at the time the enemy cues the art, not the damage they will deal when the art connects. This difference is noteworthy because it means that if not armor, reflection, rage, or some other buff or debuff that reduces enemy damage wears off between the time the art is cued by the enemy and the time the art connects, you can still be killed or take a large amount of damage from the art despite not getting a vision. Because of this, extra care should be taken when using reflection or armor-based survival strategies. This isn't necessarily a major part of vision mechanics, but something I wanted to talk about now because it will be important for the next section of this video. For most mid to high level enemies, if a vision is interrupted due to either line of sight being broken or distance between the targeted character and the enemy will try to use the same art once it is able to attack again. Some examples of this will be playing on screen now. One such example is that against Avalanche Abacy, there are a lot of crystals and rocks on 3-stage summit which can be used to break line of sight and interrupt a vision. Once you step from behind these rocks though, Abacy will try to reuse the same art, though the damage roll can differ. The only major exception I know of this rule is Despotic Arsene, who is relatively likely to use a different art if you interrupt a vision. Another point that I should make is that this art does not necessarily need to trigger a new vision. For example, if you use an art like Shield, Armor, or Reflection before breaking line of sight, the vision might not trigger once the enemy tries to use the art again. The next section of this video will cover a mechanic or exploit known as vision locking. The general idea of this is that by continuously interrupting a vision then triggering a new one, you can provide yourself with nearly infinite amount of time to defeat a high level enemy without them ever attacking you. In this section, I'll be discussing some of the requirements and nuances to utilizing vision locking. The first topic I would like to discuss with relation to vision locking is enemies leaving battles. While this mechanic is relatively well known, I still feel like it's important to discuss. If an enemy is unable to attack for about 30 seconds, the enemy will leave the battle. In most cases, this will occur due to a combination of paralysis, art seal, and the enemy blocking attacks. This can also occur if the character being targeted by the enemy is in a location that the enemy cannot reach. There are some exceptions to this rule, which I will talk about in the pathing locking section of this video, but in general, this 30-second rule does hold. This mechanic is important to vision locking because this 30-second timer can result in an enemy that is being vision locked leaving combat. These 30 seconds are not running while the vision timer is running. However, the time between interrupting a vision and triggering a new vision does count towards these 30 seconds. Because of this, if too many visions are interrupted or if too much time is spent between interrupting and re-triggering visions, enemies can leave combat. Another important thing to note about vision locking is that many high-level enemies do not begin using arts until they have taken a certain amount of damage. In addition to this, enemies tend to use arts at a higher frequency once their health has been reduced by a decent amount. Because of this, vision locking usually cannot be set up consistently until a substantial amount of HP has been dealt to the enemy. This is usually relatively easy to set up, as most parties can deal decent amounts of damage to superbosses in a single chain attack, even with relatively strenuous restrictions imposed. However, it is something that is worth considering. For more specific information about how enemies use arts and trigger visions, please refer to the earlier sections of this video. The final section of this video will be over an exploit I refer to as pathing locking. The general idea of this exploit is based around an exception to the rule of enemies leaving combat after 30 seconds of not being able to attack. Application of this exploit is somewhat limited as it has some pretty specific requirements, but it's something that I felt was worth covering in this video. The way that pathing locking works is that while an enemy is pathing towards a character and taking damage from being attacked, they will not leave the battle. However, enemies will still leave the battle if they are led outside of their normal aggro range, such as leaving 3 Sage Summit while fighting Avalanche Abyssy. It should be noted that both of these are requirements. If the enemy is not in the walking animation, they can leave the battle, and if the enemy is not taking damage from player attacks, they can leave battle. The most notable use for pathing locking is that of being able to easily defeat Avalanche Abyssy with an Ether attacker. Clips showing examples of this strategy being used against Abyssy will be on screen now. While I have been able to pathing lock different enemies in other locations, these are the only places that I've been able to find consistent setups. Pathing locking also has some other interactions that I'd like to discuss, as well as a few things which can break the lock. As right now, I know of 3 ways which pathing locking can be broken, and the enemy will begin behaving normally again. These include the enemy blocking an attack, burst affinity being triggered, and evasion being triggered. Because of this, pathing locking is most effective when only one party member is alive, the party member attacking the enemy is using ether attacks, and when there are no other enemies in combat. Depending on how the pathing lock is set up, the lock can also be broken when the enemy attempts to use an art. This is not an issue for all pathing locking setups, but I have run into this problem myself before and wanted to make mention of it. Finally, it's worth mentioning that pathing locking is not a perfect science. As far as I know, I'm the only person who's done any major experimenting with pathing locking. I've done some experimenting with it in different situations, so I'm relatively confident it works as I've presented here. However, due to me not being able to fully explore all possibilities, it is possible that there are some aspects of it that I'm making incorrect assumptions about. This video was originally intended to be a Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition anniversary video, but I wasn't able to get the video made in time. As I continued to work on this video, it continued to grow in scope until it was a significantly larger project than I had originally intended. Superboss battles have been a major part of my experience with Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition, and these are some of the mechanics that I've learned from this experience. I've tried to avoid giving too many specific cases in this video, but I still hope it's clear how this knowledge could be useful for various difficult fights. If you made it this far in the video, I hope that you found it interesting and that you learned something. If there's anything in this video that's incorrect or incomplete, please let me know and I'll investigate it. If I confirm that any of this information in this video is either incorrect or incomplete, I'll make an amendment in the description of this video. With all that out of the way though, I do hope that you've enjoyed this video and I'll see you in the next one. See ya!